Hello, everyone, and welcome to Epic Realms. Today on Epic Realms, we have an amazing guest. He is a legendary author, fabled game master, writer, creator. The list goes on and on. He doesn't necessarily need an introduction, but he's getting one anyhow. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Ed Greenwood to Epic Realms. How you doing, Ed?
I'm doing fine. Hi, everybody. Yes, I am Ed. It's Helen here.
So, for those that don't know, which they should, Ed is the master of Forgotten Realms, which is one of the largest campaign settings in Dungeons and Dragons. However, he is not limited to that, as you heard by the intro. He does all kinds of things. He has many other books, novels, series, anthologies. Dear God, anthologies, and we're going to talk about all of those tonight. But my question for you is: you weren't always the Ed Greenwood of fame. You were just a kid in Canada, weren't you?
Yep,
Where
that's
did
right.
did where did you get did you start off role playing at a super young age, or did you like how did you get into role playing?
Well, okay. There really wasn't role playing
Mm-hmm.
uh, as an industry, as a fantasy gaming thing.
Yeah.
Because when I was a little kid, Lord of the Rings hadn't been published yet. There were no role playing games. There was a healthy board gaming industry, but
Okay.
it was heavily weighted in favor of 1890s classics like Steeplechase and Snakes and Ladders and stuff that were being brought back for Under the Tree every year. And I knew about role playing because my dad was in the military, the Canadian military, specifically radar defense as the Cold War got more and more frigid.
Okay.
Um, and the ancient, and by ancient I mean we're going back to Napoleonic times and before. Um, the Germans had a game called Kriegspiel, and it was really officer training.
Okay.
And everybody has used it since, and you probably remember it as broken telephone
Oh
or
yeah,
a
yeah.
camp game. Okay, well, what they used to do is they used to take all their junior officers and put them in different rooms of a house or a bunch of barracks or whatever they had. And some of them would have to be runners, and they'd all have maps ruled into grid squares, and then they'd reproduce the fog of war by sending runners to one place saying, a report from the front, this place here is that this is happening. What are your orders, sir? And the guy would give the orders, and they go running off to the next room and he says you're to do this. And then, of course, we were testing the fog of war. We were testing how good you were at decision making and what happened when somebody comes back and says, all of a sudden there's tanks coming over the hill. What do you mean there's tanks coming over the hill? And
Yeah.
how you dealt with. Okay, so that was called Kriegspiel, and everybody has done it since, and that was the earliest role playing, and that's the only sort of role playing. Um, that plus capture the flag and versions of that, and there were versions of capture the flag that you played in Wolf Cubs, and before you were considered safe, and this happened with guides and brownies too. Before it was considered safe to run all over the place, punching each other and grabbing a flag, and you know, racing through a potentially dangerous forest, falling all over stuff. So to replace all that running around bit, they had these things where you replaced the flag with a message that had to be relayed.
Oh.
So you turned it into a sort of spy message drop type game
Okay.
to take away the running. It's sort of like when you're in a high school cafeteria or a gymnasium and somebody else no running because the
Yeah.
kid is running for
Yeah.
safety. So yeah, it was the same thing. They were doing that. So those were the only role playing because there was no industry. I'm older than dirt.
So what did you so let me get this straight. Did you play those games then? Or did you like hear about them and then later when,
Oh,
other
I
stuff
played
came?
some of them
Okay.
with my dad and so on for fun.
Okay.
And I also played a venerable old game that's been redone a number of times called Diplomacy,
Okay.
which is um, a board game but done with orders and negotiations. So it really has a role playing element.
All
And this
right.
is the famous game that got people arrested during the war because they'd be playing um, diplomacy and they'd send a telegram. Germany, will you support me in my attack on France? Italy, and then men in trench coats would show up your door and want to know why you're doing it. I also played chess, and all the stuff. With your grandparents, you played euchre and all those
Yeah,
card
yeah, yeah,
games.
yeah.
And the thing that was really interesting about euchre for me was not the game, just as cribbage was mind-numbingly boring after a while,
Yeah.
but it
Still
was
is.
my yeah, it was mind-numbingly boring to my grandparents too. So they would do things that absolutely made my jaw drop as a little kid. Like they deal all the cards face up. And then they'd say, "Oh, you would have won that, you would have won that, you would have won that." And they'd gather the cards again, shuffle, and pass it around the table. Or I'd be watching one of my grandpas says, "Oh, I'm going it alone." And I'd run around behind the table and look at his cards. And he had nothing. He was bluffing the entire thing because he
Wow.
was so bored with playing euchre. After it's a get together gossip
Yeah,
session
yeah,
excuse, like most good beer and pretzels games are.
yeah.
But when he was bored, he would just like, okay, I'm going it alone. And
Okay.
you just to see what the mayhem that would it's sort of like saying, yeah, I'm going to take the brakes off this car and drive it along the expressway and see what happens. And, and would think, wow. But then it almost makes it role play
Yeah.
because you're reading people's faces and you're seeing all the tells. And of course, that's what they were doing too. Can I bluff people by the way I lick my lips or change my expression or the way I finger my cards and rearrange them? Are they going to think I've got something that I don't have? Can I mislead them? It was like, never play poker with these people. Okay. But I mean, I was basically bored by games like that anyway, the
Hmm.
totally abstract games. I even found chess boring for a bit because I wanted the tactical thing.
Yeah.
So I wanted a part of the board to be strategic. Like if you gave me a chessboard with a river across it and a bridge in the middle and a couple woods to hide in, all of a sudden it's way more interesting to me. And of course, then along comes my love of fantasy and science fiction and space opera and early war games like Jutland, which was played um, you made your lone little model ships just out of pieces of cardboard. You laid them on the carpet or floor of a giant room. School gymnasium was usually big enough. And you played ships of the line in about, the dreadnought era where you couldn't see very far. So you had a vague idea that ships were over there. And sure enough, you could see there were little cardboard cutouts somewhere over there on the other side of the room. But you didn't really have the range. You didn't know exactly where they were. And you'd fire at them, and
Yeah.
it was a very interesting, and it was played with rulers and burst circles and stuff like that. And then Donald Featherstone's Airfix figures and all of his wargaming books, I devoured all of them. And then along came, you see, role playing is much later, so
Yeah.
I was already writing stories set in the Forgotten Realms. It was a world for my fiction when I
Hmm.
was 5 and 6 years old, long before there was a game, about a decade before D&D was
Right.
published.
And now that you mentioned that, I was like, so for those that are listening, this is not the first time Ed and I have spoken.
Yes.
We've been on. I've hosted other podcasts where we've interviewed him, and now that he mentions that, I'm like, I'm an idiot because I already knew that. I remember that because we talked about it last time, and here I am doing the one faux pas that I listed for myself. I told
That's
myself,
okay.
don't ask the same questions that everybody asks, which is not always impossible, or it's not always possible. But at the same time, it's like, well, here I'm asking not only the same question other people might have asked, but I'm asking generically, not exactly, but I'm getting at the same point that I've already found out and I've already gotten the answer last time on a podcast I was on. So
Doesn't matter. It's okay.
I know,
Jeez.
I know,
Yeah.
I know. So were you a good student in school?
um, well, it depends on which teacher you ask. I did graduate with 90s out of 100.
Okay.
Um, but I was bored crapless all the way through school, and I would often bring um, the latest fantasy or science fiction book and read it in class. You see,
Were those frowned upon in school at
oh
that time?
yes, very
Okay.
much so. But you had to be able to listen with half an ear,
Hmm.
and when the teacher saw you reading and tried to trap you, you had to be able to snap right back at them so they knew you were paying total attention to the class. And gradually, I managed to educate my teachers. Teachers, they take a lot of educating.
Right, right.
Students have found this, over the years. It's that some teachers don't realize the job of the teacher is to be educated by the students,
Right,
not the other way around.
right.
So it takes some of them a while to cotton on to this, but I managed to learn most of my teachers that I was probably going to be about a week ahead of what they were teaching, unless it was math. I was terrible at math. Hold up some fingers.
Amen to
But
that. Amen
yeah,
to
well,
that.
I had a father who was a physicist, so he would, well, don't you realize, son? Isn't it obvious? No, it's not bloody obvious, Dad. If it's obvious to you, and
Right.
of course I had horrible math teachers who would cover the blackboards all the way around the room with a huge long equation and say, so you see, again, we end up here. But there's a more elegant way of doing it. And they'd start rumming out what they'd done while you were still trying to puzzle it out. They'd say, you could jump from here to here. If you just think, you would go, kill me now.
Right. I'm done.
Kill
I'm
me
done.
now before I build any bridges and they fall down and everybody falls to their death because I don't get the math because you're not teaching me. So anyway, so I was entertaining and I had a job for most of the time when I was in school, so a teacher would say superciliously, well, if you paid attention, Mr. Greenwood, maybe you'd get a good job when you graduate and leave the school. And I think, I'm already writing novels and pulling down 40 grand a year. How much do you make again? But I wouldn't say that because
Right,
I wanted
right.
to survive to the end of the day. Um,
Well, and you were writing stuff for magazines and stuff too, right? That's some of the stuff
yeah.
you were doing way early on, if I
Oh,
recall.
sure. Yeah, yeah. My father had trained me to this because when I was writing stuff when I was 5 and 6 years old, you see, I was reading everything he had in his den,
Okay.
and he had everything from pulp novels and what passed for sleaze and porn in those days. Peyton Place, folks. Forever Amber, really steamy stuff. Although I did find a battered paperback called um, The Nude Said No, and I devoured it and searched his library for years for The Nude Said Yes, never found it. But anyway, but I would write pastiches of the authors that inspired me, and they were not The Nude Said No. They were
Are you
Lord
sure?
Dunsany. Yeah, yeah. I was Roger Selazny, Michael Moorcock, all these, and I would write my own and various what I would call first person smartass snark narrators. Roger Zelazny did a bit of that, but there were lots of them in the hard boiled private eye who would the guy would the main character would talk to the reader. And
Right.
that's sort of Sam Spade,
Yeah, yeah.
the damn light had been going on and off, on, off. So I emptied my 6 shooter into it. It was driving me nuts. I'd been in this office 20 whole seconds, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So you copy stuff like that. Do it, write a pastiche, because I was forever running upstairs and embarrassing my dad in the middle of one of his dinner parties by saying, Dad, this book was great. Do you have another one like it? And I'd hold up some lurid paperback. Oh, hoot trail, she was staked out nude in the sun to die. It says the cover, and my father would go, son, well, if you want another one of those, you're going to have to write it yourself. That author died in 1943. Oh, okay. And I'd run
Going right it.
downstairs to the den, and my aunt, my mom had died, so I was being raised by my grandmothers and my maiden aunts, and they'd grown up on farms in the Depression. So for paper, you saved all the brown paper bags from the supermarket.
Oh.
We got brown paper bags in those days, kids. Plastic hadn't been invented yet. Bakelite had been, but not plastic. So, and they would iron the paper bag flat and slit the sides up and save the pieces of paper. And that's where you jotted stuff on and you gave it to the kids with crayons. So I would write a pastiche, and I'd show them to my dad because I was proud of them. And my dad was tickled pink. He thought they was hilarious, and he'd take them into work. So all these guys who are designing missile defense systems and radar to keep, us safe from bombers coming over the pole, he'd pass them around, and they loved them. Hey, Bob, get the kid to write, a chase scene. So I'd do that, and you'd say, okay, a sex scene, and my father would say, he's 5. But I mean, I was learning to write
Right.
by copying, doing pastiches of writers, good and bad, but I was learning their styles as I went without even realizing it. So, and then I wanted to write my own fantasy stories, and that's where the realms came from.
Okay.
I was writing a setting for it was growing behind the stories.
Right. And I think it's great, and a lot of people don't realize that having family support to support a person that's writing is insurmountable in their development. If you wouldn't have had people go, hey, write this, oh, hey, write that, oh, this is great, you're doing a good job.
Yep. And my father was a master reverse psychologist too.
Oh.
If he'd do things like, he'd say to my baby sisters, he'd put them in a room to play, the basement usually, with a small toolkit and a bunch of odd scrap lumber. And then he'd leave the room, and he'd turn around as he was leaving, like Columbo used to do, just one more thing, he'd turn around as he was leaving the room, and he says, no, when I come back, I don't want to see that any of those have been touched. And then he closed the door, knowing that about 10 seconds after he was up the stairs, they'd be into everything.
I love a good Columbo reference, by the way.
Yeah.
Some people are like, who the heck's Columbo? Well,
yes.
You need to know.
Yeah.
Look it up.
Yeah.
Watch the whole.
Look it up.
It's probably on Netflix or something. So, at what point did you get like WotC? Not WotC. It was TSR, wasn't it?
It was TSR.
TSR came to you, and I know you were working for magazines and doing stuff for them already with write-ins, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I started writing for Dragon. Well, okay. It was about the time of issue 19 of The Dragon, as it was then known, that I subscribed to it and started getting it regularly. And I started, like many other people, saying, "Oh, I could do better than this."
Right.
And in my case, it was they brought out a box game called Divine Right, which is a fantasy board game.
Okay.
And the problem with Divine Right is it was one of those games where it had a paper map board, a glorious color map of the fantasy world, and then a black border all the way around. And they wrote the rules on the border, and also had reinforcements and stuff that you bring in during the game. They have little outlines for you to put the little chits on, so you can play the game. And one of the rules was for a place called Greystaff, which was a place where it was supposed to be an ancient Neolithic site sort of thing, and you could sacrifice your own armies, slaughter them at Greystaff, and get an earthquake or a tsunami or lightning bolt from the heavens.
Yeah.
And the rule ended in mid-sentence. So obviously there was something missing. And then there was the counters that you punched out. There was a large southern kingdom called Shukassim. And in the rules, it had this many units, but on the counter sheet, it had this many more. So obviously there's something needed fixing there. So I wrote a fixing article with what we had done playing it. Just here's our house rules for fixing these little glitches. And they saved it for issue 34, which was their Divine Right theme issue. But in the meantime, they'd revived Featured Creature, which was a column they'd had earlier, as something called Dragon's Bestiary.
Okay.
Which was a thing for monsters, and it said down at the bottom, anything published here is official as anything in the monster manual, and you'll get paid $25, which was a lot of money. I was Canadian. The American dollar was worth about a third more than ours, and $25 was a lot of money then.
Right.
I would say its spending power was equivalent to about $225 today. So when you're a kid in school, that's a lot of comics. That's a lot of records. That's a lot of drinks that you shouldn't be buying. That's so
you have someone else buy for you.
Yeah. So I grabbed my father's trusty old Underwood 8. And by the way, if those of you who want to learn how to write, not longhand, but using typewriters, an Underwood 8 is the perfect typewriter to start with if you can find one. Because if you drive your car into it, the car loses. It's that massive, okay? Anyway, and I wrote up a monster, which was the Cursed, and was published in Dragon 30. And I was so chuffed to get this little postcard from Tim Kask, who was the editor. They just mailed out these 3x5 postcards. They were green because Tim was Irish, and they had Celtic knotwork all the way around the edge. And it says, he checked off, your thing has been accepted. Expect to see it in a future issue. So I wrote a second monster, which was the Crawling Claw that appeared in Dragon 32. Well, I mailed it away. This is yesteryear, folks. Do not try this today and expect the same results.
Right.
I mailed it away, and 16 days later, my issue of Dragon came back with my monster printed in it. And I said, wow, they must be desperate. Because they obviously opened the mail and they had to retype it.
Yeah.
Because it was just sent in typed. They had to just input it or keyline it, whatever they were going to call it. But they had to input it right then and there to get it into the issue. Wow, they're desperate. So I started writing monsters, and I wrote so many that two things happened. One of them is they saved a whole pile of them for Dragon 40, and the other one was they paid attention to me. And the next thing I did, I wanted to write something for me. So I wrote Gates. They retitled it From the City of Brass to Dead Orc Pass in One Small Step, Gates in AD&D.
Okay.
And of course, I'd originally called it Gates in AD&D. And all it was going through all the fantasy novels I loved, from William Morris's The Wood Beyond the World to The World of Tears by Philip Jose Farmer, to Roger Zelazny's Amber series, to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Everything that had gates, or what we now call portals, and portal fantasy, but it was then just known as Gates. And I just wrote them all up into a huge article of how you could use all these things in your games. And apparently I vastly impressed the assistant editor of Dragon, Kim Mohan, because it was the first article he'd ever received that had footnotes.
Okay.
So that he wrote me a letter accepting it and saying, are you coming to Gen Con this year? Well, I am now.
Right.
and he took me for a stroll out in, it was in the University of Wisconsin Parkside campus, which means you could just bash open these glass doors and out into these beautiful rolling lawns that look like a golf course. So we just went for a walk. He said, how would you like to be a contributing editor? And I said, great. What does it pay? He goes, that's the contributing part.
Right.
But I loved it and he loved it too, because he was a journalist first and a gamer second, and he needed somebody he could assign stuff to.
Okay.
Because he got all this stuff that people just mailed him, what they call the slush, the over the transom, and he got all this stuff from inside TSR, which was stuff that wouldn't fit in the product, the cutting room floor stuff here.
Yeah.
And he was trying to build each issue of the magazine, and the issues gained and shrank by 8-page signatures, depending on how many ads they'd sold.
Right.
So suddenly he needed something to fit around. So it would be really nice to have short stuff lying around on particular topics, so he could add it as themes and take it away. And then he could turn around and say, hey, would you write? So the Ecology of series was an assignment.
Oh,
Wizards 3 was an assignment. He assigned it to me, and he could get stuff back. And I did the 9 Hells, which I wanted to do for me.
Right.
and so I was doing a mix of fun stuff, just whatever came into my head that went with D&D and went with the realms. And that's how TSR noticed the realms, because I'm a shy Canadian. Okay, I've overcome the shy bit. I'm still a Canadian. But so I always thought it was incredibly arrogant to say, hi, you've never heard of me. My name's Ed Greenwood, and I thought of a new way of rolling dice that none of you schmoes have thought of. So here it is.
Right.
I thought, oh, that's terrible. And I also was acutely aware, because they kept telling us, that every player who could read Dragon as well as all the Dungeon Masters. So I didn't want to say something definite like, in the third room in the castle there are 6 orcs and their
Right.
hit points are blah
Right.
blah blah.
Yeah.
Because some nib sitting at the table would have read the issue,
Right.
so he'd KO the dungeon master by metagame knowledge. So instead, I'd use a mouthpiece like Elminster, an unreliable narrator who says, "It's rumored that there are orcs in that ruined castle, but I don't credit it myself." And then you can plant the idea without saying anything specific
Right.
because you're not speaking as the omniscient. So I just put the realms in that way. And for my own players, I considered that I was being fair to them because I was giving hints and stuff because they didn't bring their magazines to the table, but they
Right.
all read Dragon. So,
Right.
they'd vaguely, didn't Ed do something about a 6-legged monster? What the heck was that again? Yeah. So, but that was sort of what their character might have heard in gossip inside the realm.
Right.
So,
So
so
they
I
wouldn't
was
be
doing,
using out of character information in character or anything like that.
yeah,
They could legitimately have heard something along those
yeah.
lines.
And if it was a monster, it was now official
Right.
and theoretically balanced.
Were you playing at this time then? Were you
Oh,
actually
yes.
role playing? So
Yeah.
when did you start? When were you introduced to role playing? Because obviously, as you said, you were writing. When were you introduced to D&D
So D&D,
or role playing in general? Like
oh,
not role
well,
playing. D&D.
ro-
We've
yeah,
already covered the role
yeah,
play, but
Kriegspiel, yeah.
Dungeons and Dragons.
When the first 3 booklets came out of the original D&D,
Okay.
and we bought them, we thought, oh, this is a really cool idea, but it's just going to devolve into an argument around the table.
Right.
But we did also buy Greyhawk, Blackmoor, and Eldritch Wizardry, the next 3 books, and they were far more impressive. They added the thief to the game. They added mind flayers, beholders, really cool magic items. So they were real idea hooks. And we played for a little bit and thought this is cool. But it wasn't until 1978 when the Player's Handbook came out to join the Monster Manual. And I looked at them both and said, oh, this is really cool. This is Jack Vance's magic system from the Dying Earth,
Mm-hmm.
where you impress the spell in your memory by great effort. And then once you cast it, it's forgotten.
Yeah.
Which stops your magic user from becoming a machine gun.
Right.
Boom, fireball, boom, lightning bolt, boom,
Right.
lightning bolt, whatever we need to win. So and it turned it back into these are really cool. And at the same time, we had the monster manual with all the monsters from mythology, from everything from vampires to dinosaurs, plus all these cool new ones, all ranked against each other. Perfect. This is now going to be the unofficial backbone or skeleton for my fantasy writing because it's going to keep me honest. It's going to balance things. And then we all joined the waiting for Gary to get the Dungeon Master's Guide out, which was a horrible wait. And if you're old enough, you remember Dragon 21, which was combined with Little Wars, had the tables for the Dungeon Masters, the combat tables for the Dungeon Master's Guide in it, because he'd gotten them finished and he was acutely aware that Dungeon Masters were waiting for the book. Here's the tables so you can at least play for the rest of the year until we get the book out for Gen Con. And so I was D&Der by then, really enjoying it. And Jeff Grubb, a designer on staff at TSR, wrote a position paper. He was asked to, a proposal for a unified game world for the 2nd edition of D&D. And because Dragonlance had taken all of the company's resources and 2 years of time, they were looking for a world that wasn't built around a single epic story, but was a kitchen sink world that they could put jungle adventures in.
Right.
Became Malatra, the living jungle. Arabian adventures in, which became El Khadim. Oriental adventures in, which became Hello, Oriental Adventures.
Right.
So, I mean, and they had these pyramid modules and all sorts of things. I got a phone call from Jeff Grubb one day at the public library I worked at in a suburb north of Toronto, saying, hi, you don't know me, but my name's Jeff Grubb. I'm the designer at TSR. You write the Forgotten. You're Ed Greenwood. And I said, He goes, do you have a complete detailed world at home? Or do you just make this up as you go along? And I said, yes. And yes.
Right. And we've discussed in the past, like before when we talked, one of the major questions, because here's an urban fantasy thing that still to this day, every once in a while I'll be at a gaming thing and I'll hear it at like a convention. And then I go over, it's like, well, just so you know, I talked to Ed, and this is the truth, that you don't have, like, we know you have, but we can see behind you, you've got a library of books. And we had to clarify this last time we chatted. It's like, do you have a library? We have books that are written of every detail, like here's a city and a card catalog. And you told us the answer. No, you have a lot of stuff written down, and it was, all in, boxes. And but it's not like a library, like a,
No,
big shelves and stuff.
these are fun books I read for love and inspiration. And my rule books are all over here, the 5th edition ones. The others are downstairs in another room. I have books in every room of the house, and all those papers are in 2 shipping containers in my yard.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So I wanted to re-bring that up and get that urban myth out of the way for new people that might not know. Because I've heard it, no joke, I've heard it so often that I'm like, I'm so glad that we asked that question and got that taken care of. When you were gaming with your friends and you were gathering them, how did you bring the idea to them? Did you meet up because of role playing? When you first kind of got your group together, was it birds of a feather kind of flock together? Did you already know each other and hang out for other things?
oh yeah, most of it that we came to play together, we were friends at school, and we already read fantasy books and walked around talking about them, impatiently awaiting the next one in the series. But no, there was a brilliant young lady named September who was about a year or two older than the rest of us at the time, who was what I would call the perfect dungeon master.
Okay.
I mean, she put on funny voices. She dressed in costumes, and we would gather in a ravine. You see, one of the things we could do, we lived in a fairly wealthy area, but it had ravines, meaning it had to stop floods, the rivers that ran through it, they left little ribbons of wild nature to stop erosion.
Okay.
So they were public parks, but not groomed whatsoever. And there was one area where a particular part of the Don River went through a sandy area, and every time there was a storm, it cut new sandbars. But a, the river curled around sandbars. So if you could wade across the river or take stepping stones, you ended up on this almost an island of sand that changed all the time, and it was overhung by all the trees growing there, which is what kept it from washing away. So that would be your gaming session.
Okay.
Which means you bring food, bring games in your knapsacks, sit around in the ravine for a weekend afternoon and just game for hours. And that's September inspired us all to do that. She was a great DM, and we didn't know it, but she was dying of cancer already. She didn't know it at the beginning, and so of course she very soon died, and that left the rest of us to do our own thing. And we sort of went our separate ways and followed our separate interests, and then finally got together again. But we were already together because we sang in the same church choir,
Okay.
or we were sat beside each other in high school. You know.
Did you play other role playing systems as well around
Oh
that time?
yeah. Um,
Are there any that really stand out to you, or things that you really like? Man, I'd love to play that again, or anything of that nature?
um, Call of Cthulhu, um, Traveler. Although Traveler was almost a joke because you rolled up your character to start and usually died because you had to do all these rolls to see what skills you had, what military service you've done, and usually you died in the rolling. So it was like, okay, start over again. It's like,
Yep.
really? You know. But I mean, yeah, that Traveler was great, and of course, every time they published a new stellar map of the Spinward Reaches or whatever one part of it, you go, ooh, gotta have that, and so as they laid the galaxy out in front of us. But yeah, that and Call of Cthulhu, but it was mainly D&D.
Okay.
We tried all the other games. We tried Tunnels and Trolls when it came out, Chivalry and Sorcery, Superhero 2099, Villains and Vigilantes came along a little later, and we were also devouring everything that was in Dragon, from the backgammon board to Snit's Revenge to Awful Green Things from Outer Space later on. So we were playing all these fun little board games, and of course we were also being dyed-in-the-wool war gamers. Fortress Europa, Dragon Host, and all these games where you punch them out and you have 4,000 playing pieces
Right.
and a board that covers half your wall. And in fact, I remember going into a long gone gaming store in Toronto called the Battered Dwarf. And John Dunn, the proprietor, had a sheet of galvanized steel hung on the wall behind his checkout counter with counter magnets holding a game board on it, and all the units were there. And he'd say, "You got 10 minutes? Got 15 minutes?" We'd say, "Yeah." He goes, "Move the Germans." And we'd
Oh,
do one move, and then we come back a week later to see what the Allies had done in Virginia. And the game was very slowly unfolding in the store, and everybody would come in and look at it, meaning they had to look past John above his head, which means inevitably they saw all the new stuff that he had displayed in the store.
there's a marketing ploy right there if I ever heard
Yeah,
one.
yeah, and I mean this was a store in a converted house. We were in the parlor or front living room of a converted house. He'd only rented one half of it off the front stairwell. The rest was other tenants. So there wasn't a lot of stuff in the store. It wasn't like a gaming store these days where you go in and there's tons of stuff for
Right,
miles. And there were no collectible card games back
right,
then.
right,
None. There were card games, but I mean, the most collectible was, hey, this year there's Playboy Playmates on this regular deck of playing cards,
right,
or
right.
here's the latest baseball or hockey players for this season
Yeah,
on regular playing cards. Collect them all, but
right.
I've already got a
The
deck
whole,
of
yeah,
playing
you get
cards.
the deck of, yeah. When you're role playing with your friends and you're building, new worlds, not, obviously Forgotten Realms, but other, worlds, as we mentioned, you play other games. Is there a key that you have for making your own, people that are listening that might be GMs, that might be new to it? If you're making your own world, is there one or two, little quick notes that you'd be like, this is a key that's really helpful for building, for world building, as a GM?
Well, over the 55 odd years or 56 years I've been doing this, I've tried just about every way.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no one true way. There's what works for you. And that can differ over time, and it can differ from project to project, and it can differ with who you're doing it with. So if I was doing a role playing setting, um, right away I asked myself, what am I going to use this for? Like, am I going to write novels? Am I going to write short stories? Am I going to do art set in? Am I going to do little board game mini games like Chase the King through the Haunted Castle or something like that? Or am I just going to be role playing? Answer that. If I'm going to be role playing, how long does it have to last for? Am I building a campaign I want to last forever, like the Forgotten Realms, a world? Or is it a campaign I want to last a summer, say, or 1 or 2 years? And it could be something. And okay, here's a perfect example of that. Game of Thrones is a shorter campaign because you are literally using up the characters. You are touching off something in which characters will be eliminated. If you watch the Samuel L. Jackson YouTube video where he gives the guide to Game of Thrones partway through, he says, something to the effect of when the Starks are there, he says, "Nice family, don't get attached," you know, because they're all going to go.
Right.
So that's you're building in a time limit that is already built into, say, a Call of Cthulhu campaign if you play it rules as written,
Right.
because everybody's going to lose their sanity
Yeah.
and stop. Their character is no longer able to do anything except blurble away in a corner and
Right.
not function. So that character better have kids or better train an apprentice, because they're going to have to take over when Grandpappy just sits in the corner and wets himself because he's seen too many great old ones. So
Right.
um so you're thinking about how long do you want this to last, and then you're thinking, what do I want it to be? Do my players like dungeon crawls? Do they like hack and slash? Do they want to bring back monster trophies? Or do they not want to draw their weapons at all and spend 4 or 5 hours in court intrigue? Good my lord, I could not help but notice when the lady stepped out last evening that she had two garters on, not just one. Does that mean something to you? And then glide away. So if that's what they want to do and play, you're going to have to set up feuds, intrigues, rivalries between houses. The good old Romeo and Juliet. Two houses alike in dignity. You know, you're gonna have to set up that thing.
Yeah.
And then the world has to make sense. It not only has to be geographically interesting, like having a bay with city states around the bay, and then a crossroads thing in the center that's going to get all the traffic and be strategically important, so somebody might want to conquer it. And for a good example of that, read Guy Gavriel Kay's fantasy classic Tigana. It ends up in one kingdom, which is the Crossroads Kingdom. It didn't set out to be that way, but it is that way. It starts there and it ends there. But anyway, you set up with something so it's going to be interesting. It's going to drive traffic into conflict.
Right.
And then you decide what sort of conflict you want. There's almost no interest without some sort of conflict, but are you playing with your younger siblings so that you don't want anything sexual and you don't want people killed?
Right.
So are you in effect doing My Little Pony / Harlequin romance or Barbara Cartland romance with kissing is as hot as it gets? Um, you know, are you setting that up, or do you want Game of Thrones? Do you want people butchered in front of your eyes, and do you want people shouting in triumph and pounding the gaming table because they killed the Tarask, or they took all the eyes off of Beholder, and now
Right.
they want to fry and eat the eyes? Because that'll be cool, right?
Right. Right. Right.
So you have to figure out the style of play and because
Who your
if you get
audience
it,
is.
yeah, because if you get it wrong, they're not going to want to go on playing.
Right. Right.
So those are how I would approach the design of something. And then the other thing I would say, if it's your first time designing anything, any fantasy setting, whether it's for a one-shot play session, or I think this will last about 6 play sessions before we run out of steam, or a fantasy world you're going to write novels on for the rest of your life, start small. Start in one spot and think of it outwards from there. What is the most cool stage you want to have? Mervyn Peake, the fantasy author, wrote a marvelous trilogy. Well, 4-book set, now a 5-book set posthumously, but the Gormenghast trilogy. And the central character in this is the huge haunted castle of Gormenghast. So if you've got a focal point, start there
There
and
we go.
decide, well, how does that push my buttons? Where do I want to start? What
Right.
do I want to have happen? And then you can literally, let's say it is a castle or a country mansion. Okay, I'm going to walk around this country mansion in my mind, either inside or outside the mansion. I'm going to look in all directions. What's over there? Oh, mountains. Write down mountains, range of mountains. Are they a barrier keeping me from this horrible kingdom full of goblins over there? Or the place where the dragons live that we don't want to go, but the
Right.
dragons come to eat us every so often? Okay, so you write that down. And there's a huge wood there, the wood that stretches for miles. Nobody knows where it's far side. Okay, write that down. So you see, you're now building outwards from your castle. But if there are all sorts of foreigners, outlanders coming to the castle, envoys to see the king, they've got to come from somewhere. So there's got to be other places, rival places. Where are they? Are they across the sea? Okay, where's the sea?
Right.
So you build it that way.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, and I'm just going to briefly bring this up. You mentioned the word Harlequin romance.
Hmm.
And there is a rumor that I heard that you may or may not have been involved in a book of some sort of that type. Would you care to
Yes.
enlighten a little bit?
Okay. There are ongoing contests out there where friends of mine are trying to guess which Harlequin I wrote. So I'm not going to tell you which one because it's a lifelong fun game for them, and I want somebody to win it fair and square by guessing right. And I've already set down the rule. You can't just say, "Is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this one?" until you've been through all,
Right.
couple of. No. You have to. You get so many asks. It's like accusations in the game
Yeah.
Clue. Okay, so yes, I have written a Harlequin romance under a pen name, and I have also rescued Harlequin romance was written by others. Because here's the thing about writing novels. Many people can start a book and then they bog down and can't finish it.
I'm guilty as
Okay, yeah.
charged.
Yeah, okay. Now the way around that is different for every person. And I will give you the fun little thing, the rock video method of writing a story. Okay, I tell this all the time. Go onto YouTube, type in Madonna Like a Prayer, turn the volume off because you don't want to hear the music,
Hmm.
because the music affects your mood
Yeah.
as you watch it,
Yeah.
and you don't want to hear the lyrics.
Yeah.
All you want to do is watch that video, and you can use other ones, but it has to be a video that tells a story,
Right.
not a video that shows you the guitar player's pelvis and then cuts to the and then back to the. It has to be something that tells you a story, and you're just paying attention to what they put on screen and for how long. What do they show you? What images are there, and how many story beats, and does it tell a coherent, satisfying story in 2 minutes or 6 minutes or 4 minutes,
Right.
whatever it is, and you just sort of study them. What stories work for you?
Okay.
And then from that you go, okay, I need to write the beats of my story, the big scenes. Like if you were writing the Fellowship of the Ring, okay, there's the meeting bit, where they all get together. There's you're going to have a big battle. You're going to have the Council of Elrond. You're going to have a big battle and getting into Moria and so on. And you take 3x5 recipe cards, because I'm old. That's all we had. You can just print them out on your computer on sheets of paper, and you need the floor or your bedspread. Make the bed first, or a
Right.
table, whatever you got, and lay them all out on it. And then you put them in order. These are the big scenes I want to have in my book. And then you put blank pieces of paper in between them and say, what, and draw an arrow for that scene, arrow up to this next scene. What's the minimum I have to tell the reader to get from here to here,
Point A to
so that
point B.
that
Yeah.
scene will have meaning and impact? Like, do I have to explain who those 6 evil princes are before I see them all killed? Yeah, I do. So that has to happen somewhere before that. So you
That's a
write
nice little
those.
trick. Yeah.
Yeah, you write those on the thing and just write them all down. And then stop trying to do what I learned to do, what everybody who learned because we wrote longhand or on a typewriter.
Right.
Either way, you tell the story chronologically from beginning to end. And that is far more orderly and easy to keep in your head. That's how you bog down. Whereas if you take all these pieces of paper or cards that you've laid out on the table and you just pour it all into one huge computer file, and then save it, please save it, save several versions of it so that when you mistakenly screw it out, you still have it. Okay, then you can start working everywhere. You can add a little bit about the gems that were all over the king's, or the queen or the princess is at a feast, and
Right.
their whole front is glittering with polished gems, and you want to make up some new sorts of gems and what they look like. You
Yeah.
type in that little bit, and then you go over here and because you just overheard in real life one guy being cuttingly rude to another guy, and you said, oh, I'll have to remember that. That was really good. Well, you put it in over here where you're
Right.
going to have
Yeah.
2
Yeah.
nobles fighting. And then you just build the novel in little bits. And that's another way to build a novel so you don't bog down.
Awesome.
Ta-da!
Nice. Now we've mentioned Forgotten Realms. I'm sure there are a lot of people that are listening to the podcast and the stream and would be remiss if I didn't at least touch a little bit upon Forgotten Realms, which obviously we've mentioned on here quite a bit. But you've done so much, and there have been so many authors now that have come in and picked up and written in your world. People that are fans of yours. We've had a few of them on here. Eric Scott to be, for one, came on and like was a fan, and then got to flush out parts of Waterdeep. So for you, what kind of work do you do to help people that are writing in your world? Obviously you don't have an ego about your world, but there's still, you have stuff written down or ideas, or like, this is kind of what's in here. And some of them have mentioned they'll get ideas from you, or you'll say, well, these are here, and whatever. So what is kind of the process when another author is working in Forgotten Realms and was writing? in that world, and how was your interactions with them usually?
Okay, sure. I was never on staff at TSR or at Wizards.
Okay.
Okay, I was always just a freelancer.
Okay.
And I always overwrote in the early days until they asked me to please stop doing it because it made too much extra work for them. But at the beginning, it was a boon because they'd ask me for, oh, Ed, can you just write up a little adventure? We only need 4,000 words. And 20,000 words later,
Right.
they just chop it because they really only needed 4,000 words, and they take all the extra stuff and throw it in a barrel, and it would be another product. Uh, Paul Jaques, now Janelle Jaques, got most of what was in FR5, the Savage Frontier, because it was stuff I overwrote for Waterdeep in the North. It was the North part of Waterdeep, and they said, no, we can't fit all this. Oh, here. And they got a new product out of it. Okay. So I was always doing that. And unofficially behind the scenes from the very beginning of the realms up until today, like as in earlier today, whenever anybody's working on the realms, they know they can shoot me an email or pick up the phone and call me or contact me on Twitter or Facebook. And then I'll take it to an email so that it's not shared with the world.
Right.
And yeah, I will give them lore. I will suggest things. I will say, well, there's a skeleton buried in that closet. Oh, you don't even know where the closet is. Let me show you. And then there are people, dedicated people, particularly Eric Logan Boyd in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and George Crashos in Australia, who have made fan careers out of explaining away inconsistencies in the lore and filling in all the backstory. And um, just today, I sent some language stuff. We work on lexicons of Dwarvish, Elvish, the Orc tongue, Giant tongue, Alzado, the old Kalashite tongue. I mean, right? And so we're
Right.
constantly adding words to the vocabularies and putting sentence construction in so Dungeon Master can have an incantation or can have an inscription and that sort of stuff. We trade back and forth all the time. So yeah, I always help unofficially. It's for free. It's for fun, and you don't have to use it.
Right.
Like if I'm talking to a wizard designer, they will usually say, "Hey, what have you got on?" and then fill in the blank. And I will tell them. And they understand. You don't have to use this. You can do your own thing. But it's here as a weave in the tapestry. I can see the whole tapestry. So I know that if you do something like this, it weaves this together with that. If you need it to be different for a story reason, that's fine. You've got the keys to the vet. You're driving it. I
Right.
expect you to take it for a spin. But this is what I do and why. So you know what you have to fit in with to make the overall tapestry that we've been weaving for 55 years
Right.
richer and hang together so that somebody who bought something 40 years ago doesn't open a brand new product and everything is different. It's like, but for 30 odd years I've been using, you know. So I
Right.
mean, I'm still and now that Dungeon Masters Guild is available as an outlet, I'm working with lots of folks to do stuff. I did the Border Kingdoms with Alex Kammer last year, which was the unfinished bit of the setting that was I kept getting short circuited on polyhedron and so on,
Right.
dying under me before I could finish those cities south of the Lake of Steam. And right now, Alex Kammer and Alan Patrick and I are working on a Thay product,
Okay.
and a bunch of other gamers are working on Rashomon. Joe Rasso is helming that one, and he just like hit me up on Discord, and we talked about, hey, what about this, or do you have anything on that? So I just handed him,
Nice.
but it's going to be his baby. And before, I've already worked with Steve Fiddler of Vorpal Dice Press on um, the Elminster's ecologies, or rather, um, Elminster's granddaughter
Okay.
and they were literally biomes, like deserts of the realms,
Yeah. Yeah.
forests of the realms, and we went all over that. And I worked with another group of people, a whole bunch of people, to work on Elminster's Candlekeep Companion, stuff like that. And it's just fun to help. It's fun to let other people have their, because when you cross the Rubicon of selling the realms, which I did back in 1986, so it's a shared world, then it's not my world anymore.
Hmm.
everybody should be welcome in it. Everybody should get a chance to write their thing in it. All I ask is that when you come into it, you don't just say, "Oh, everything that was already written and published is wrong. I'm just changing it." No, no, no. You
Right.
can change it, but give me an in-world explanation of how it changed, why
Yeah.
it changed, how we got from there to here. Don't just say, "Oh, everything previous was wrong. I'm ignoring it. I'm doing away with it." No, no, no. Weave into the existing tapestry. You can cut a hole in the tapestry and say, "I need a window in the tapestry right here." Good, but stitch the edges and make it look nice.
Right.
Make it look
Right.
like part of the tapestry.
How much when we're talking, since we're talking about, other people working on stuff and creating it, how much involvement did you have with any of the video games that came out? Neverwinter Nights, the Baldur's Gate, things like that. How much involvement did you have with those?
Early on, and we're talking the SSI games
Okay.
back then, um, I had fairly high involvement, but it was hands-off involvement. It was,
Okay.
"Hey Ed, what have you got on this?" And then they would then throw the chunks of lore to
Okay.
the outside licensee. And then, I wasn't even supposed to know who the outside licensee was because
Okay.
I wasn't a staff member. So
Right.
this is a
Right.
trade secret.
Yeah.
And it was like, in fact, I even had an interesting thing years ago where the new edition of D&D, I got a call from a gentleman who was the lawyer for TSR at the time, who wanted to know why I needed to get copies of these books. And it was and it was and with it was coming the new Forgotten Realms setting, and I explained to him that they were sending it to me for consistency purposes because I'd created the setting, and he immediately legally cautioned me, "Don't tell lies like that, because you'll get in real trouble." Because he assumed that I was lying, that I hadn't created the setting, because as far as he was concerned, the company owned the setting. So
Right.
who was this guy? So, but I mean, yeah, so there are times like that. But but yeah, there were increasing involvements. I actually did a voiceover and some stuff for Turbine when they redid the Haunted Halls of Evening Star and
Oh.
expanded it. So I've done some voiceover work, and for outside the realms in other companies, I worked on computer games. The old BioWare. I did worked on the Two Towers game,
Okay.
but we're going way back.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
games had diskettes and you loaded them in.
Right.
I've done some voiceover work and been asked to
Okay.
portray stuff, but I've haven't yet put on the video capture suit with all
Right.
the light bulbs all over it, and because for one reason I am no longer the action hero I once was. Yeah.
And you don't do much with like the storytelling or the how the stories play out in some of those at all.
I've had some consultation with some of them,
Okay.
more so with ones outside the realms.
Okay.
Like I designed the story for a computer game called Mages of Australia
Okay.
from Borealis Studios, and I'm working on another one now that I'm not allowed to tell you
Okay. That's
about.
fine. I
But
understand.
but no, by and large, when it comes to actual programming, that's done in-house by a
Yeah.
studio,
Yeah.
and where they want the story to go, that's the sort of thing they jealously guard because they don't want a leak or whatever.
Right.
So, although I can tell where the story's going because, hey, I've been writing fantasy longer than
Right.
most of these people have been alive, and they're asking me to detail this place, this castle, this city,
Right. Right.
this haunted river. I can see where this is going. If there's a haunted river that has dragons layering in caves all the way along it, guess what? You're going
Right.
to end up fighting those dragons. It's sort of obvious, but they deliberately don't tell me, and I deliberately don't ask.
Right.
That's the and this is going to sound terribly sexist, but I'm old. That's the gentleman's agreement, to use the old phrase, which is masculine gendered. But it works with the ladies too. You come to this polite agreement that there are certain things I won't ask and you won't tell.
Right.
I think the U.S. military has a phrase, "Don't ask, don't tell," which now means something completely different, but
Right.
didn't
Right.
back in the old days.
Yeah.
It meant that it was a need to know, to use the older military phrase, and I understand that, so I don't ask.
So besides Forgotten Realms, you had a bunch of other series that aren't necessarily set in the Forgotten Realms. Whether you want to, give us a little brief blurb about them. There's the well, of course, my handwriting is horrible.
And the four,
Yes,
the
that
yes,
one. Falcon
the
Far, the novel of Niflheim, What
Yeah,
can you tell us about those
sure.
series? How those came about?
There was a gentleman, no longer with us now, I'm afraid, Brian Thompson. He was head of TSR's books department. We became very good friends. He would call me weekly and we'd chat for hours about life, the universe, and everything. Um, and when he rejoined Tor Books,
Hmm.
Tom Doherty's magnificent fantasy and science fiction publishing house, one of the things he wanted to do was, hey, let's do D&D, but with the serial numbers filed off. And I said, what do you mean? He says, good, tell me a good old fun, low swords and sorcery lunch bucket fantasy, but use the 4 D&D character classes: magic user, fighter, cleric, and thief. So that's what the Band of Four books are.
Okay,
Band of Four, and
because there's
it was,
four.
yeah, ta-da.
Imagine that.
And the thing about the Band of Four books is there's this cool palace I put into it, which is shifting, changing constantly, magically, and it became a central character. So the 5th book in the in the 4 book series is all about the palace. It's the history of the palace. Um, and then the other one, the Niflheim books, there's 2 Niflheim books, and they were, uh, hey Ed, Gary Gygax went one way with the Drow, and it was really popular, particularly in Bob Salvatore's novels.
Hmm.
But what if you go back to the root Norse mythology, the Doc Elfar and the Svart Elfar?
Hmm.
Okay, and what if we take that and you give us a dark elf setting that isn't Drow and doesn't have Lolth and doesn't have matriarchy and doesn't have all that stuff, so you can actually see the dark elves in a different way.
Okay.
And I did it from the point of view, I wanted to do a fish out of water book, so I decided that my um, dark elves, they had a religion or cult or belief of beauty, physical beauty. And one of the ways you stay beautiful is you don't do hard manual labor, because you might get scars, you might cut your fingers off in the chainsaw, whatever. So you raid the surface world and take human slaves.
Okay.
And it goes from the point of view of a human male, as it happens, who does all the forge and smithy work for a particular dark elf um, city. And what we see right near the beginning of it, he's planning to escape. He hates his overlord, who is this female dark elf who comes along and flogs him regularly. And circumstances are going to throw them together, and they're going to have to depend on each other, even though they hate each other's guts. Because I thought that would be a very interesting story to tell.
Yeah.
And evidently did well enough. They immediately wanted a sequel, so there it was. And then Brian died, and everything changed, and so that ended there. So the next thing I did for Tor was with David Hartwell, who has also unfortunately died, and he wanted me to do a steampunk book. So there's a 1 book standalone called The Iron Assassin. It was
Yes.
going to be a series, and then David died, so now it's not again.
And you also had a Paizo book for Pathfinder,
Oh, yeah,
the
Wizard's
Wizard's Mask,
Mask.
which
Yeah,
I have to say that's one of the most unique and fun books. I loved the concept of that story
yeah,
because it was very unique and just a little bit different. When you're writing tie-in fiction like that, because obviously it's not something you created, but it's like a tie-in. Do they ask you to stay within the confines of the system for that, or did they just say, "Hey, you're Ed Greenwood, do whatever you want"?
it was closer to the second, but it wasn't do whatever you want, because
Yeah.
James Sutter, who was running the fiction line, was
Yep.
a friend of mine, and we could talk back and forth. And because of what we wanted to do in the book, we were crossing the borders from one kingdom to another.
Hmm.
And Galarian was brand new then,
Right.
just come out in 1 book, I think, called The Inner Sea Lands, or The Inner Sea.
Yeah.
We hadn't seen Galarian in all its glory. So I had to conflab with him. Okay, you've got this kingdom here and this very different kingdom right next door.
Right.
What's the transition
Right.
zone going to be like if my characters are crossing through it? And we also had this little difficult thing because what we had was this small female halfling with a guy, and they were working and traveling together. And we were both sensitive to the fact we don't want it to seem like creepy older male hitting on young girl.
Right.
And I said, yeah, but they're not even both the same race.
Right.
He goes, that never know mine. That's still an optic we have to. Okay, fair enough. And I wanted them both to be without any sex. I wanted them to both be like fellow soldiers in the same foxhole. They got comfortable with each other
Right.
presence, even though they started out not understanding each other
Right.
or
And that
liking each
did
other.
that. And I when I went through that, I totally got that, and I thought that that was really well done.
Because thank you, but that, you see, that's the thing. A story should be a journey for the characters, and it should be interesting, and there should be something in it that the reader can relate to. Going, oh, I've been in those sort of awkward situations, or oh, how's she going to handle this, or
Right.
because then it immediately the story means more to you, rather than and then they killed another orc, and then they opened the door and killed the next orc. What's behind door number 3?
Right. Right. Well, from there, you started the Ed Greenwood group, and that's the last time I chatted with you. You were promoting Helma, Storm Talons, uh, all kinds of really good books and stories came out of that. Um, and I don't know, I a couple people that have been on in the past were really sad about how that came to be at the end. Would you like to talk
Oh,
about that at all?
there's still things I can't talk about it,
Yep, and
but
I
yeah,
understand that. I understand that.
uh, the short form is there is no more money,
Okay.
so it had to go defunct.
Okay.
And because I do not intend to die being a dick, I
Right.
gave the rights to all of their work back to the authors
Right.
so that they can republish them if they just file off the specific things
Yeah.
for the settings. And what I did was different settings for every genre and subgenre. One for space opera, one for high fantasy, one for low fantasy,
Right.
one for portal fantasy that's vaguely gothic. But the same sort of stuff you'd mine in Call of Cthulhu,
Yeah.
or that's sort of. So I was doing different world settings for each of these things, and at the moment they're all just lying quiet. Well, I sort out shutting the company down and all that stuff. Uh, but so in the meantime, um, I had heart surgery, COVID hit, everything changed, and what COVID meant for a lot of my friends, and I've been working in the gaming design and writing and being a book collector and working in public libraries too for like 50 odd years, and all of the people all across the world who had pet back burner projects they'd never had time for.
Right.
They looked at COVID and said, this is my chance. So a lot of them emailed me or Facebooked me or phoned me and say, hey, Ed, could you do a monster? Could you do a villain? Or could you just do up this, city or whatever? And so I have been tearingly busy for the past year and a bit helping everybody else get their pet projects in because I want to see all these things. I
Yeah.
want them on my bookshelves. I want them on my gaming table. And I achingly understand their desire to get their pet project out there. So if I can help, I'm gonna. So that's what I've been doing now. So as a result, I haven't been writing too many of my own novels now. I've been helping everybody else with it. And
Right.
there are big time consuming things like the Fate of the Norns box set I'm working on, Ath Cleath, or excuse me, the one thing I have to say, people who speak modern Gaelic go, no, it's not Ath Cleath, it's Clea, or whatever. There's only one problem. Modern people alive today will argue 3 different pronunciations for that city, which is, by the way, Dublin. Okay,
Right.
but the Gaelic name, the old Gaelic name for it at the time we write about, which is the Vikings conquered it in the 790s AD, and they hung on to about 8 860s AD before they were pushed out. And we're doing a role playing game, which is not my role playing game. It's Andrew Volkoskis's role playing game, Fate of the Norns. But we're looking at Viking ruled Dublin in around 835 AD. So I am designing a complete detailed city. If you don't care about Vikings and you don't want to set your campaign in the real world, you can just file off some of the Norse names.
Right.
But the intent is eventually it's going to be a living city in the same way that TSR meant living city in the old days. Um, the we will be doing follow-up products with adventures and more non-player character packs and detailing the city. And we're going to super detail the city in a series of books, not all in the first box set. But the first box set will give you what's in every building in the city as an overview. And about the eastern third of the city will be super detailed. So for every character, every building you walk into, there'll be at least one character detailed, and that character will have a dirty secret that if you find out, you can maybe work with them or manipulate them or blackmail them or whatever. And it's so you're going to get a living city. You're going to know where the water comes from. You're going to know where people empty their chamber pots into and where
Nice.
it goes. You're going to know all the trade flows of the city. And this is happening in the Celtic twilight, Ragnarok. The
Right.
world is turning darker. The sun is no longer in the sky. The crops are failing. So, and King Citric, the one-eyed king, and he's one-eyed because as a teenager, he did a blot or sacrifice to Odin, so he plucked out one of his eyes just because Odin only has one eye.
Right.
So he's on the throne, and he's managed to gather together um, the whole slave trade for the worlds into this, and all the money's coming with it. So it's a city where money is pouring in, and all these traders are pouring in, merchant traders, and it's therefore a good adventuring thing. And I'm going to detail every last business. So I'm going to do the legwork so you can have a fun fantasy city to play in.
That's amazing. And we do have, for those that are listening or who are in the live stream, we do have the link. Um, you can get most of the Fate of the Norn stuff through the drive-through RPG link we have on there that's available so far. Our website also has the link there as well.
Oh, and I should add one thing here.
Yeah.
That the designer of this, Andrew Volkowskis, designer of the game, who is also the publisher, Pendelhaven, his previous Kickstarter, the one that's just ending, is called Children of Eriu, which does the Irish. And he made the updates to that public,
Oh,
not just for backers. And
nice.
in them, he talks a bit about Athliath, the box set, so you can get a closer look at it. Because we haven't yet launched the Kickstarter for this box set. It's going to be the Ultimate Viking Kickstarter. I've written a novel called The One-Eyed King. Michelle Franklin has written a novel, The Misadventures of Mindel. Stephen P. Pearl has written a novel, which the last word of the title is Spear, but I'm trying to remember the rest of it. Should be somewhere here on my desktop. He's going to kill me.
That's all right.
There's a graphic novel done, the story part of it done by Andrew, and they're all going to be part of this Ultimate Viking Kickstarter, which hasn't yet started.
Right.
So I mean, you're not missing anything yet, and I'm not pumping it. I'm just making you aware of, if you're interested in this at all, that's where you can find out more.
Well, maybe when that does come out on Kickstarter, we can have you and him come back and chat about it. How does that sound?
That sounds great to
sure
me.
People would love to,
Oh, yeah.
to have that and chat about it. You gonna be? Are you doing anything? Are you doing Gen Con? Are you doing any online things coming up?
I don't think I can do Gen Con this year.
Okay.
I will be doing Phantasm, which is a local Peterborough, Ontario con.
Okay.
I hope to get to Game Hall Con, but at the moment the border is closed.
Okay.
And I can't.
Right.
And the way things are trending around me, we have a fourth wave in this province. I may not physically be able to attend Game Hall Con.
Okay.
So we're still playing that one by ear. There is a gaming lounge in Curtis, Ontario. Well, actually, just outside Whitby on Highway 2, called the Critical Hit Gaming Lounge, and they want me to do a writing workshop there, and so I'll be doing that. And people should go online and look for Critical Hit Gaming Lounge or something, and see if announcements for that because that's still being arranged.
Okay. We'll see
Okay.
if one of our mods can get the link in our stream, and then
Okay.
we can pull it up on our
Cool.
website.
Yeah,
Throw it on there
it may
later.
not actually be there yet
Right.
because Dominique and Valerie, who run Critical, may not have put something up
Okay.
yet. We might still be talking, but those are the sort of and I do stuff online, like with Lord Gasumba, Jay Scott, Greyhawk stuff, and that's coming up. And this Saturday, I'm yet again online with Quest for the Cure, as our party of intrepid, bumbling characters continues to try and quest to save the universe,
Awesome.
because that's what we do.
Yes, that's what we should all do, actually.
Yes.
You are at the Edverse on Twitter.
Yes.
Do you run the Fans of Ed Greenwood page, or is that somebody else?
No, that's run Fans of Ed Greenwood page. Oh boy, I'm trying to remember all the people who run it, and I can't at the moment. Jeff Thetford and Curry Russell, who also do the Mages and Sages podcast and have me on fairly regularly as a guest. They set stuff up, and
Okay.
I don't have time to do any of that
Right,
stuff.
right.
You know, and computers. When I was a kid, computers were people.
they should still be.
Yeah, and then they were climate-controlled buildings with guys in white lab coats, and the computer filled the entire building and had all these little tape rolls that went around. So you know, now that I have these little, I had Macintoshes for years, and it was like, oh, wonderful. And my father would look at it and go, huh, that is more computing power than 3 of our buildings. And I go, so Dad, why aren't you, producing it 3 times? And he'd say, shut up. And I'm becoming my father as I get older. It's like, why aren't you doing all this stuff? Shut up.
Awesome. Well, we thank you for coming here and joining us on the podcast. For those that are watching the live stream, we will get to all of your questions as soon as we're done recording the podcast. So much appreciated, Ed. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely. Coming up, you spoke earlier of James Sutter. James Sutter is going to be with us on September 20th.
Wow.
He is amazing. He's agreed to come with us. He's got his own books. Obviously, he was kind of one of the leading roles in all of the Pathfinder Paizo novels, and as well as the role-playing system. So he's going to be joining us as well. We aren't going to be doing anything for Labor Day yet. We're not going to be having a specific podcast episode, but we may be doing something extra special on the stream. I'm just still hammering out the details. October 18th, we're going to have Jeff Tidball. So you want to hang out for that. Jeff Tidball is the owner of Atlas Games. He also just purchased Prolific Games, and we're going to talk about that little merger and everything else that he has to do in the tabletop board gaming world. So thank you, everybody, for joining you. And I hope you come back again for the next episode of Epic Realms.